A way to pull the rug out from under Hamas, or a scheme to permanently chase Palestinians out of parts of Gaza. Israel insisting that a brand new Geneva-registered aid group aims to deliver long-awaited relief to secure distribution sites while preventing the Palestinian militant group from diverting food and medicine. With the United Nations out of the loop on this one, and Gaza residents forced to travel vast distances, mostly for what looks like rations, the international community warns it's a bid to force the displacement of a population that's only seen a trickle of aid. There you see the distribution sites under this scheme. A trickle of aid since March the 2nd, and when an embargo began. What is Israel's ultimate goal? And will the United States sign off on a move condemned by some of the Jewish state's closest allies like Germany and Italy? More broadly, what's to become of Gaza's 2.4 million citizens, two-thirds of whom live in refugee camps? The daily bombing continues, but is there a plan? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if aid's being weaponized when it comes to the Gaza Strip. We'll be joined shortly from Oslo by Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. With us from the town of Alex in the south of France, Eran Tsikiau, research associate at the Forum for Regional Thinking. Tell us what the Forum for Regional Thinking is.
Hello, Francois, and thank you. The Forum for Regional Thinking is a research think tank or a research institute based in Israel, based in Jerusalem, where I'm from. I'm in a research leave here in France. And it is mainly a group of what started originally as a group of Middle East and Islam scholars from Israel who wanted to present a different kind of discourse to Israelis about the region, the Middle East, from a more empathic approach that tries to look at Israel as part of the Middle East and not like some Israelis present it as a villa in the jungle, right? So this is basically, it's a group of kind of progressive scholars that today represent a critical discourse based on expertise in Israel regarding to Israeli approach toward the region.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. This is well Alexandre Chatillon, director of the humanitarian aid group supernova.org. You work in the Gaza Strip.
I do, and 120 people from our organization as well do. We do provide recreational activities and education for kids, about 1,000 a day. And we also provide psychological support to women in the Strip for about 1,000 women as well a day.
All right, and with us as well, our Jerusalem correspondent, Noga Tarnapovsky, on what's been a busy News Tuesday where you are. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you for having me, Francois.
Well, we can now cross to Oslo, and Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib joining us, resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. And before we dive into the issue of the day and this Israel-backed scheme for distributing aid, on social media you've been writing about some personal news, what with one of your relatives killed in the past week.
Yes, thank you, Francois. I've been sharing the details about my dear cousin, Ibrahim, who is an officer for the International Red Cross. And he was killed in a targeted airstrike by the Israeli military. For no discernible reason, he has been making sure that all the spaces where the Red Cross operates are free of munitions, of weapons, of Hamas. He was killed in a drone strike on his family home, the temporary home, I should add, where they evacuated to from Rafah. It was not a zone that was under an evacuation order. The Red Cross put out a statement that said the Israelis need to respect the sanctity of aid workers, humanitarian workers. But how much longer are we going to see this pattern repeat itself over and over? Aid workers, ambulance workers, doctors, medical personnel, the list goes on and on. This is just further testament to the brutality of and the futility of the targeting mechanism of this war and how horrendous this has become.
And Ahmed, our condolences go out to you. What is the rationale, you think? What is the strategy here behind what have been daily bombings that have killed dozens each day in the last week?
Well, one of the things that has been really interesting to read is that the strategy for, supposedly per the reporting by Times of Israel, is shifting away from killing the maximum number of terror operatives to now focusing on Hamas's infrastructure and trying to reduce that through the destruction of civilian infrastructure, access to aid, distribution and of aid. And that begs a question, well, what has the last year basically been for? I mean, the IDF is targeting one or two persons, and in so doing, they take out an entire city block, and in so doing, they take out an entire building. So the rationale is that this one terror operative, which I've been seeing some of the analysis and some of the news and some of the confirmation coming out of Gaza, has been as low level as just a street operative for Hamas, and as high level as, you know, some of the big targets. I understand those big targets, but the low level ones, a lot of the bombardment that we're seeing on a daily basis that has been claiming hundreds of lives daily, really, the Israeli military, according to some of the assessments that I'm reading, are going after low-level terror operatives. And some of my own Israeli friends who were in the security establishment have called this the tacticalization of the war. And this is a futile strategy that focuses on short-term elimination of terror operatives that are either replaceable or that don't really achieve anything in terms of returning the hostages, ending Hamas's grip on power. And we're seeing this right now with like I said, the death of my dear cousin Ibrahim, the death of hundreds, thousands of people over the last few weeks. All these civilian casualties have been to go after a few low-level terror operatives. And this is coupled with the razing of entire cities, entire areas. So the strategy has been to destroy, to kill, to annihilate, to restrict the flow of aid, and to hunt to starve, basically. And that is not an effective counterterrorism strategy.
Aaron Tika, what's your reading of this bombing campaign?
First of all, my condolences, Fuad, for your loss and the unimaginable loss of life that we are seeing, not only recently now since the beginning of the new operation, but for the last 600 days. I think that Fuad is correct when he talks about the lack of strategy and the tacticalization, focusing on tactics, on military maneuvers, but I want to bring the focus back to Jerusalem for a moment. Yesterday, we had a parade in Jerusalem, a violent parade, a racist parade filled with hate, expressions of hate, the annual pogrom of Jerusalem Day parading through the old city of Jerusalem. But it's not only a group of youngsters, and you will see where I am leading to, because in the end of this parade, these national religious youth, incited youth, they meet the leaders of the state of Israel. And Bezalel Smotrich, a member of the cabinet, said in front of a multitude of thousands or tens of thousands of his followers, we are here to conquer and to settle. And I think if we just talk about the lack of strategy, then we ignore the goals of Netanyahu's chief political allies, Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Netanyahu is a hostage, a political hostage of the most extreme elements in Israeli society and politics. And they have a strategy and they have a goal. And their goal, if I put it bluntly and simply, is deportation and ethnic cleansing and resettling Gaza with Jews. Now, it's not what we see immediately with the Operation Gideon's Chariot, but I think we cannot ignore this aspect. So I wanted just to connect it to yesterday's event in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Day Parade, the speeches of Smotrich and his partners, and to maybe say it's not only tactics and the lack of strategy, which is clear. There's also something else here, and it is a religious extremist ideology that is behind Netanyahu or leading Netanyahu's political party.
Is it a majority view right now in Israel? I'll put the question to Noga Tarnapovsky because we saw opinion polls last week, most notably in newspaper Haaretz, that showed that Israelis were taking a hardline stance.
I'm not sure which poll you're referring to, but since way before this war started, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been an unpopular leader, and it might be worth remembering even now that he won in the end of 2022, his most recent election, by the skin of his teeth. His coalition actually had less votes than the very dispersed and ununited group of parties that oppose him. That said, he has a very firm hold on power today, and it seems to me every single poll I have seen opposes completely, a vast majority of the citizens of Israel opposing every single policy of the Netanyahu government. Among those policies, the ongoing war in Gaza, the insistence on war and no other pathway. It is opposed by around 70%, sometimes more, sometimes just hovering under. In every poll, more than 100 polls since the war started, and I haven't seen any shift in that. I do sense a shift among the Israeli population, maybe not of opinion, but of tone, a sort of exhaustion. More and more Israelis speaking of simply considering leaving the country, a feeling of absolute hopelessness and helplessness that I think is washing over the vast majority of Israelis.
All right. And meanwhile, again, we get to the heart of the matter here. There is this scheme by the Israelis, bypassing the United Nations, bypassing Hamas, it says, a rocky launch for what's called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. First with its boss resigning on Sunday before the first aid delivery had begun. Then this Tuesday, we saw these chaotic scenes at its first distribution, a distribution that had to be curtailed. Emerald Maxwell has more.
It wasn't a good start for the US and Israel-backed aid group. Footage circulating online shows chaotic scenes with thousands of Palestinians overrunning one of the newly opened distribution sites. In a statement, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, said its team had to pull back to allow people to take aid safely and dissipate and to avoid casualties. There were also reports of gunfire as desperately hungry Gazans flocked to one of just 4 distribution hubs for a population of 2 million. Controversially, the aid sites have been operated by shadowy private American security companies, while the Israeli army secures the surrounding area. It started operations Monday, despite the unexpected resignation of its executive director, who declared the operation lacked independence, and amid concerns that Israel would use it to weaponize aid and displace Palestinians who'd be forced to move for food.
As we have explained many times, we do not participate in this modality. It is a distraction from what is actually needed, which is a reopening of all the crossings into Gaza, a secure environment within Gaza, and faster facilitation of permissions and final approvals of all the emergency supplies that we have just outside the border.
The new system is designed to wrest distribution away from humanitarian aid groups led by the UN. The GHF said it distributed about 8,000 food boxes Tuesday, totaling 462,000 meals, despite, quote, blockades imposed by Hamas. Little is known about the GHF. Staffed by mercenaries, it was registered in February in Switzerland with obscure backers. The New York Times reports that the project is an Israeli brainchild and has been in the works since the start of the war.
Alexandre Chatillon, you've been in touch with the people at Gaza Humanitarian Foundation?
Yeah, on multiple occasions. I'm a practical person. I'd like to go beyond what is said in the media. So I spoke to them last week to better understand what they wanted to do. It's really unclear at that stage. I've even reconnected with them today, knowing how things were going. There is an interest for them to deliver aid, to deliver food. I mean, the people I spoke to at a personal perspective were interested in their job, in making the job done. However, they are based out in Tel Aviv. They were only settling in Israel, which is very interesting. The mere fact that they were in Tel Aviv setting up their office is very different from what a humanitarian organization would have done in setting it in Jerusalem. So it's a symbol of their affiliation to the Israeli regime. So
Why is that?
Because they are based out in Tel Aviv, so their HQ is in Tel Aviv. And usually when you're doing a humanitarian for Palestinian territories, you would be in Jerusalem.
Because you're closer to East Jerusalem.
Of course.
Yeah.
And being in Tel Aviv, you're closer to the Israeli authorities. So in doing so, it's a message that it sends, I am close to Israel. So beyond...
And this was just exchanges by text message.
Yeah, we called one another last week.
What nationality are they?
It was American. They were Americans.
Right.
The CEO, the Chief Operation Officer, is an American national. Very kind gentleman, however. But he was very much into delivering aid. However, we did not go too much into politics. But what is interesting today is the locations of their distribution sites. It is, for now, quite obvious that they want to pull people out of their home and drag them down to the south. That's an obvious move from their location of distribution. Plus the fact that it was not very well mastered. This distribution had to be stopped along the way, and it has been stopped for tomorrow too. It was supposed to restart tomorrow at 9, but based on the overwhelming number of people who are starving in the strip, they were not able to deliver the aid in a safe way. So they stopped for today around like 3-ish. And they won't distribute tomorrow, and the resumption of the aid is supposed to happen the day after. So it's not enough prepared. It's not well prepared. It is obvious that there's a scheme behind. So I'm very skeptical, as the UN, as everyone in the international community, on how they will do things, and if it's not serving a bigger plan, which is Israeli-American backed.
Did you sense these are people with experience in the humanitarian field?
Definitely. They were. They knew what they were talking about. They were interested in supporting people. It was genuine. Now, how will they do that? The next few days will tell us more about their intention.
All right, I want to pick up on 2 points that we saw in that report. Late last week, and Emerald Maxwell mentioned it in the report, the New York Times stating how Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was first thought up in the wake of the October 7th attack. The Times story says, quotes, one of the top consultants to the project, whose words are reprinted in a report put out by the Israeli military, in which he says, pulling the rug out from under Hamas will come once Israel begins to work directly with the civilian population, manages the distribution of aid itself, and begins to take responsibility for building the day after. A Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which rests on the principle of a third party to distribute the aid. For that, it's called on the services of a security logistics company called Safe Risks Solutions. It's headed by an American called Philip Riley, a former CIA station chief in Kabul. Let me ask you, Alexandre Chatillon, getting this third party to be in charge of security, they obviously were a little overwhelmed this Tuesday. What do you make of that?
So it doesn't seem to be very effective. I'm a humanitarian practitioner, so it goes against any sound principle of how you manage aid. You don't need to have a security company to distribute aid. You need to be organized. You need to collaborate with Gazans, with the head of communities. That's the way you deliver aid. You organize things to make it happening. Having a security company from a third country operating the security services, as bad as it was today, is only harming people rather than helping them. So I don't see that as a good thing. On the contrary, this is contrary to any good practices, any logic on our sector. It's only serving the purpose of militarizing the situation. More forces on the ground, more forces with weapons, and it's a very bad thing at the opposite of what should be done.
Had you heard of Safe Risk Solutions, this private security company?
Never before.
Is it, from what you're reading, is it a same thing as kind of what we saw with Blackwater, these kinds of private military companies?
I don't think it's a private military organization, though I am not a specialist. My feeling that has been set up with a view of securing the distribution of aid, with a political mandate saying that by doing so, we will prevent Hamas from looting the trucks and the aid. Truth is, on the ground, my staff and I, when I was on the ground, I don't see Hamas coming in and taking the resources for the population. I am not supporting Hamas. On the contrary, hostages needs to be delivered. But the reasoning, the rationale saying that we need a military organization on the ground to prevent Hamas from seizing goods from the population it's false on practical on the field in the field.
So Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, help us make sense of this, because if this, again, according to that New York Times report, was something that had been in the pipeline since 2023 or early 24, that had been thought through, and then why is it off to such a rocky start?
Well, the folly of this plan is that it was conceived at a time early in the war when there was this belief, the idea similar to how the Americans were in Afghanistan or in Iraq, would actually have this direct contact with the Palestinian population, this like up close contact. And as the war, I should say, dragged on or perhaps devolved, and due to the mass killing of Palestinians, due to the massive amount of destruction, the mistrust by the Palestinian population toward the IDF made it impossible to conceive of a direct one-on-one engagement, if you will. And so this idea of an Israeli-approved kind of hybrid approach that brings in a third party became necessary to create a layer of separation. And I've actually advocated for this out of a pragmatic desire. I mean, I was not a proponent of this aid mechanism, but seeing that it was going to happen anyway, and out of a desperate desire to stop the starvation or slow it down, I said there needs to be an external party that's not Israeli that separates the Palestinian population from the IDF. Now, unfortunately, the concentration, the fundamental problem with this whole plan, which is why I have long in the past, during acute emergencies in Gaza, been a proponent of short-term use of airdrops. The main problem is that when you have a desperate population and you have a concentrated point of aid distribution, that's when disaster happens. That's when stampedes happen. That's when criminal enterprise move in and wait outside to either loot the aid or to abuse some of the people to force them into selling the aid for really cheap, and then they turn around and sell them in the black market. And yes, Hamas absolutely steals a lot of the aid that made it into Gaza through different schemes. It's not as simple as they just hijack the trucks, although they sometimes did it. They have thugs, they have black market trade people, business people, and so on. But this plan did the worst of the worst, which created like 2 to 3 concentrated distribution centers where a hungry population of almost 2 million people was forced to congregate en masse. And there was no short-term relief before you went from starvation to all of a sudden you're going to offer people a box with something like 8 kilograms of food. So of course people had a stampede. Of course the site was overwhelmed. I mean, I appreciate what my colleague in studio is saying, but I doubt that these people actually know what they're doing. I doubt that these people actually took their models and applied it The model is as good as the variables that you inject into it. And the Gaza variables, I mean, any humanitarian worker with the World Food Program, with my brother is on the ground, he runs medical aid for Palestinians, they're all their field work. I have a ton of colleagues who are involved, not just my cousin Ibrahim, who was murdered, but all sorts of folks who are involved in the World Food Program. In third-party companies, yes, I have had one of my other cousins, my mom's first cousin, has been involved with a private international corporation that oversaw the Gaza reconstruction mechanism, and he's on the ground right now interfacing with all the different humanitarian organizations. So there's a role for private enterprise, but the way that these guys parachuted in has been a complete disaster because they don't know what they're dealing with. Finally, and this is a very key point, what they did is they went into, and there's been some reporting on this, they went to 3 major families in Gaza to work with them in terms of providing the local workforce. Okay, I can live with that. But then they went with this Yasser Abu Shabab, who himself is a well-known aid thief that used to be camped by the Kerm Shalom crossing. And somehow the IDF allowed this thug, this total thief, that the entirety, a child in Gaza can tell you who Yasser Abu Shabab is. And the Israeli military allowed this thug to create the counterterrorism service. And he is now working with the UN and the Red Cross and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. What kind of a signal does that send when you have a thug and you turn them into a counterterrorism, expert, and you give them guns, not just AKs, but the IDF allowed him to have M16s, new M16s that were brought in. So this has been layers upon layers of disasters and misunderstanding, a fundamental misunderstanding of how Gaza operates, the different layers of aid, and how you actually creatively push Hamas out of the scene so that you don't get a situation where they're stealing the aid.
So, Aaron Tika, listening to what Ahmed and Alexandre are saying, who's running this show? Who is the one who's making the call on all of this?
Look, I don't know to tell you who's running the show, but when I first saw this plan, it was immediately clear to me and other colleagues that I was talking to that it's a farce that is bound to fail. And it did fail today, as we saw the first instance. It was active on the ground. You saw what happened, the disaster and the stampede. And I think, I don't know to tell you who runs it, if it's a CIA operative or Israeli generals. It is clear that there is this attempt to prevent Hamas from taking over the aid, but it is also very, very clear that Israel is trying to use aid as a tool to control and pressure the civilian population of Gaza, be it to control or to pressure Hamas, that the population, the starved population in Gaza, will pressure Hamas to cave in, to give in the hostages, or just to move them around to control the people through starvation and aid, using the aid as a weapon, and concentrating the population into certain zones or areas. And I think that it's not only clear, and it is also what IDF officials said today to Israeli media. So that is, I think, the main point here. Not only preventing Hamas from taking over the aid, but using aid and starvation as a tool to control population, move people around, and who knows, with the advance of the Gideon Chariots operation, maybe to push them further south and beyond the border of Gaza. So that's how I see this farce and this pretext of aid as a tool to control and manipulate population.
Noga Tarnapovsky, there was this total embargo on the Gaza Strip since March the 2nd. It was eased a little bit. The United Nations this Tuesday saying that it has been able to get a little bit of aid in, but it's not nearly enough. And then we saw, on screen those images of what's inside those, what do you call them? Would you call them rations? Would you call them supplies? What's in those boxes there?
Right, those are aid packages filled with extremely basic and not highly nutritive products. I think we should say that. So not only are we seeing heads of families supposedly receive packages that are supposed to feed 5 people for 3.5 days, which is truly an insulting exercise, but we're seeing, the cheapest pasta, simple flour. We're seeing not even beans. So to pretend that even if this were a success, today was a pilot. I don't think anyone can say it was a particularly successful pilot. This is the ambition of this plan is eventually to be able to feed 1 million people. Today it wasn't able to feed a few thousand. And even if it were to succeed in its wildest ambition, that's half of the population of Gaza. So it's very hard to see any kind of seriousness of purpose behind this plan. But I do think I can add, as a longtime observer of the Israeli political scene, a little bit of background or explanation for what all of your other guests have been describing at some pain as what seems like, on the one hand, a project aimed to help people, and on the other hand, a farce. So I want to quote the former defense minister of Israel, Avigdor Lieberman. He's today a member of the opposition to the current government. He just said, and I quote, that the funds for the humanitarian aid to Gaza, this current project, come from the Ministry of Defense of Israel and from the Mossad. This follows yesterday's statement, somewhat more cagey, by the head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, who basically said that it's his understanding that Israeli operatives have even been sent on the instructions of the prime minister and the finance minister abroad, carrying funds, Israeli taxpayer funds, and that these funds are being diverted in order to back this project. And what this would indicate to me is an attempt by the government of Israel to have its cake and eat it too. In other words, to be able to continue to lie to the base of this government, the minority, very radically right-wing base, and maybe an attempt even by the prime minister himself to deceive some of his most extremist ministers when he says Israel has nothing to do with this humanitarian aid. Of course, we will not in any way sustain humanitarian aid. And at the same time, to wink at the growingly upset allies of Israel on the diplomatic front that now includes even Germany, Sweden. These are conservative governments, not to mention France, the UK, and Canada. We're even hearing critiques from the President of the United States himself, who said that people in Gaza are starving. So this may be a wink to them saying, yeah, we're taking care of it, while at the same time trying to take care of the political base back home. And this clumsy effort to use foreign front companies, as the leader of the opposition hinted yesterday, may be what explains how poorly planned out this may be. And it may even explain what Alexandre was describing, which are well-meaning people who may even be experienced people, but who find themselves at something of a quandary because they too may have been misled about the actual plans in place.
What's your prediction, Alexandre, as to what happens?
For the distribution of aid now?
Can they rebound? It was a bad day one.
I think it's going to be very difficult. Well, being very human and practical, I do hope that food will arrive to Gazans who are starving. I don't know how people, how can we say and explain to the audience, the public, how the situation is terrible for Gazans, how they are starving, how it is difficult to be fed. A good friend of mine, the correspondent of France 24 in the industry, Rami, was saying to me yesterday that a kilo of tomato is about 10 euros, what it was €1 before. The kilo of flour is about 40 euros, what it was less than €1 before. People are starving. There is no food. So obviously, on a human perspective, I do hope that the food will reach these people. But on being very also practical, I don't see that happening. And I do really think that it is a political move from the Israeli authorities to say, hey, you have not been very nice. You're complaining France and the UK and then the German, who were so supportive of Israel until very recently. So we're doing something. We're releasing a bit of aid through the UN. We are allowing some food parcels to come in through this foundation. But it's a drop of water in the needs of Gaza. And we all stay silent compared to this disaster, human disaster.
Yeah, the question is whether or not the criticism and the new chancellor stating that what is happening at present is no longer comprehensible. The question is whether that criticism helps or hurts Benjamin Netanyahu. Last Thursday, after a joint condemnation had been issued, Noga was referencing it by France, Canada, and the UK. Here's what the Prime Minister of Israel had to say.
I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney, and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers, and kidnappers thank you, you're on the wrong side of justice. You're on the wrong side of humanity. And you're on the wrong side of history. Now, these leaders may think that they're advancing peace. They're not. They're emboldening Hamas to continue fighting forever.
Eran Sikiyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu doubling down domestically, is that a good strategy, us versus them?
Well, Netanyahu is, from any geostrategical perspective, I think Netanyahu is in the end of his career, and he's trying to do everything he can to polarize, to incite, like, all populist leaders around the world we know. And for him, the war is necessary. He needs to continue the war. He needs to control the aid. He needs to perpetuate the current situation in order to survive. And we all know that it's not only about political survival for Netanyahu, because the moment the war ends, Netanyahu has his own legal problems outside. So Netanyahu is probably at the lowest point of popularity in Israel today for many years. But this is a man who buried all his, all the people who predicted his fall. It's dangerous to predict when he will, disappear from the political sphere. But this is a problem that started, much earlier than October 7. Israel has been using humanitarian aid as weapon against Gaza at least since 2007, if not earlier. So I think we can broaden the discussion. And it's not about the inner debate about Netanyahu's popularity. Netanyahu is not popular. He's not a popular leader. He doesn't have a majority. But I think we should ask here in France, in France 24, what will the world do if Trump wants to do business with the Gulf, if Europe is going to take a moral stand against this current reality, which obviously doesn't serve any political, strategic logic, doesn't serve Israeli interest, doesn't serve regional interest. So this is, I think, an interesting question. What is Europe willing to do? Because we are in a European channel here, and I would like to maybe raise this question.
Alexandre Chatillon, we're having next month, perhaps France recognizing a Palestinian state.
Maybe. We do hope so. This conference in June you're referencing to in New York, that will be co-hosted by France and the Saudi, is a great step forward. France has been taking some decisive declarations recently. You just mentioned that about a few minutes ago in the communique with the UK. I think it's time. It is overdue. It's time that we put pressure on Netanyahu, and I agree with what was said by the last presenter. It is, for the clip of Netanyahu, a way for him to maintain his position into power while the polls are giving him 79% of wrong opinions against him. So it is overdue. We need to recognize Palestine. We need to have this state to be built somewhere. And that's also a tricky question.
All right. In the wake of last week's assassination of two Israeli embassy staff members in Washington, Donald Trump dispatching his director of Homeland Security to Israel. But while former South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem struck a supportive pose, there she is, touring points overlooking Gaza with the Israeli military. She also told Fox News that President Trump, quote, specifically sent me to have a conversation with the prime minister about how those negotiations are going, negotiations with Hamas, adding, quote, it was a very candid conversation. Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, is it wishful thinking to think that Donald Trump will do a 180-degree turn and force a quick resolution to the ordeal in Gaza?
Well, I don't doubt for a second that President Trump wants to see this end for a matrix of his own complex and intertwined reasons. I do strongly believe that President Trump has every interest in seeing this war end on his watch sooner rather than later. This complicates his business interests and his interests versus America's business interests. Sometimes the line is a little bit blurred, but let's just say the web of interest that his recent visit to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates have struck up trillions of dollars worth of business deals. Those are going to be undermined by the sustaining of a horrendous war in Gaza that entails mass killing and burning of people alive and the annihilation of people and statements about the intention to ethnically cleanse the people of Gaza out of their ancestral homeland, the starvation and all the associated imagery and baggage and global anger, not to mention regional instability. So I don't doubt that for a second he is going to push maximally to try to figure something out. I also don't actually doubt that he may end up being one of the few capable parties of exacting, of placing maximum pressure on Netanyahu, as well as exacting a political price should Netanyahu and his government refuse to work with the United States to end this war. However, and this is the big however, what remains unclear to me, what remains, and worryingly so, what remains to be seen is, I think the ship has sailed on the old framework of the different phases that we saw earlier this year, whereby phase 2 of the release of hostages and the Palestinian prisoners is tied to the beginning of phase 3, that is basically the reconstruction of Gaza, all of which happened with Hamas still in power. That ship has to sail. There has to be an end to Hamas's direct and indirect presence in Gaza. And it's not just me saying that. That is the people of Gaza. If you go on my X account, if you go on all my socials, I come with the receipts of the people of Gaza saying we are done with Hamas. They have served us on a silver platter to the most far-right and fascistic government in Israel's history, and we cannot have that. We also cannot have a situation where Gaza is simply reconstructed only to go back to the old mechanisms of aid reliance, aid dependency, and just the status quo. Gaza doesn't need to be reconstructed. Gaza needs to be rejuvenated. Gaza needs to become the jewel, the pride and joy of the Palestinian people, a role model for effective Palestinian self-governance, for what an occupation-free West Bank can and should look like, such that we can build a compelling case for why the international community should help the Palestinians in ending Israel's military occupation and the illegal settlement enterprise. And so to achieve that, the first step to that is not only ending this war, but ending it in a way that ushers in a transitional period that can allow for that. My concern is that the Qataris, with their overt and ideological support for Hamas, Mr. Trump, with his desire to potentially push Gaza out of the headlines and just see it end, we could see a situation where the war stops, but the conflict freezes, just like in Lebanon, effectively, where there's been a ceasefire for over 6 months, but there are airstrikes all the time. There are limits and restrictions. There's internal instability, and that hasn't ushered in the type of transformation that, it's still slowly taking place, but it hasn't allowed for the rejuvenation and transformation. So that's my biggest concern. But I also, big picture, and I speak to Trump administration officials on a regular basis. And yes, there is a desire to work in a multilateral fashion that brings in private enterprise, that brings in the best and brightest of the Palestinian people to come up together with a formula that works, and certainly to get the hostages released, to get the violence to stop, and to usher in a transitional period. But for the time being, what's even more important than any of that is stopping the starvation. People are genuinely starving. I've been trying to get people out of Gaza. I've been calling for temporary use of airdrops to saturate Gaza with food. And I'll leave you with this. I'll conclude with this. I've had some conservative Israeli friends of mine, conservative commentators, I should say, who are saying, well, what's the point if we started the aid mechanism? I mean, like, what's been the point of the last 2 months other than worsening Israel's international standing, turning us into an international pariah, starving out the people of Gaza, creating bad will among the population toward Israel, if the goal was to restart the aid, except now we're restarting it in a horrendous situation, and we don't have any clear mechanism for implementing Trump's plan of pushing people out. Even Trump himself has given up on his own non-planned plan, which was just a rhetorical statement that he made. So that's what's the tragedy of all of this, is that there really was hope among some in the Israeli government that starving out Gazans was going to accelerate the ethnic cleansing, and 2.5 months later, they're like, oops, that didn't happen. And Netanyahu is now trying to manage an angry international community, a disaster on Israel's doorsteps, and a coalition that could fall apart at any moment for simply allowing Gazans to eat. That cannot stand.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, so much more to talk about. Thanks for being with us from Oslo. Aaron Tika from Alex in the south of France. Noga Tarnapovsky, our correspondent in Jerusalem. Alexandre Chatillon, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.